Hi everyone, this is Alexander Lim and welcome to AuthorStory, a show where on each episode we speak to a different author on their particular topic of interest. On today's episode is Howell W. Woltz, who is a journalist and public speaker who has spoken on the topic of the loss of constitutional freedoms in the United States since 1977. His book is Restoring America by Returning to Its Constitution, and you can check it out right now by clicking on the Amazon link in the video description below. So, Howell, welcome. It's great to have you with us on Author Story.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Alex.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So, Howell, what made you decide to write Restoring America?
Well, as you pointed out, I've been speaking on this topic since 1977, and frankly, I had no idea that the United States would ever go as far down this path of so-called progressivism as it has, but we have basically turned away from our form of government as described in our contract with government, which is the Constitution. It is basically nothing more than a contract between the founding states, the people, and the government we created.
Right. So, just for comparison purposes, what was the original intention according to the Constitution? What do you see is what's so at present?
Well, initially, the government was created as a very, very limited entity, and the states created it as their part through the Senate. The states are supposed to elect our senators, and we people are the other party to the contract, and we voted the representatives in the House of Representatives, and together the states and the people created the federal government, voted on it, approved it. It only had roughly 17 duties, very limited, very, very limited, and was only allowed to punish, for example, 3 crimes, piracy and felonies on the high seas, counterfeiting, and treason. Now, to draw the comparison, we have basically an unlimited government with 1.97 million federal employees averaging 100,000 a year in salary, telling us what to do, fabricating laws without voting. There are over 300,000 administrative laws that have been created by these unelected bureaucrats just since I started speaking out 40 years ago. So it has gone absolutely crazy. And in researching this and trying to find the point where we really went off the path, it goes back to the adoption of a statist philosophy, a form of socialism known as progressivism. And it's anything but progressive, but that was a very clever doublespeak moniker that was given to it 100 years ago.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about progressivism? I mean, I'm sure there are quite a few people who haven't heard of this.
Well, it's what so many of the politicians, both right and left, Republican and Democrat, refer to themselves openly as progressives. But progressivism is actually statism. It's a socio-political ideology imported from Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century as a form of rule to replace constitutional government in America. Now, this ideology, I was able to track it right back to its founding point. It was a professor at Oxford University by the name of John Ruskin, and within the confines of the very wealthy upper British crust that he taught at Oxford, he began teaching this as their duty. He said because he believed that they had such hereditary and natural superiority to all other races, ideologies, and persons that he taught his students that it was their obligation to rule the world in this benevolent form of socialism. And of course they're extraordinarily racist and class and gender not neutral. So these were the biggest bigots in the world, and they had lots of money and lots of power. And one of those students was so impressed with Professor Ruskin's opening speech that he wrote it down in longhand and carried it in his breast pocket for 40 years. And that was Cecil Rhodes, who then became Sir Cecil Rhodes, and he and his colleagues that adopted this philosophy and took up the mantle and the challenge of taking over the world benevolently, of course. they organized the Boer Wars, took over the gold mines and diamond mines of South Africa, and used that to basically fund their build out of progressivism.
Mhm. Okay, all right. So this is essentially a, I don't know, how do you call it, a replacement for the original intention of a representative democracy then?
Correct. And the first openly progressive president was Woodrow Wilson. He actually wrote a book about it called The New Freedom. Again, that's doublespeak because the idea is to replace our constitutional republic.
Hmm.
Uh, Now they call it a democracy, but the word democracy doesn't appear in the Constitution. It was a constitutional republic
Hmm.
where the states elected the upper chamber, the Senate, and the people elected the House members, as I said before. So that was our original design. Now, very few laws are actually passed by the Congress. They either delegated or had that authority usurped by unknown entities, an alphabet soup of these organizations and agencies of federal government that are not allowed or authorized in the Constitution, and they now write, make, and enforce the laws of America. There are 314,000 ways now between Congress and the administrative state that they have figured out how to send us to prison. So you can
Wow.
when you can do fewer things than you cannot do, it's hard to continue to say you are free. But a wonderful book written a few years ago by an attorney, Harvey Silverglate in Boston, Three Felonies a Day, he describes this, and according to a Harvard study, Harvard Law School study, the average American now commits three of these felonies a day and doesn't even know it because they're for
Whoa.
activities that are so obscure. So basically, the prosecutors, which are, the U.S. Department of Justice and these prosecutors that work there, can basically pick their targets, usually of the opposing party and belief system, and take them down. Anybody, anywhere, anytime, because if they just pull their cell phone records, they will find one of those 314,000 behaviors that they have outlawed. They do it
Wow.
every day.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay.
We now have 5% of the world's population, less than five actually, of the world's population, but we have 25% of its prisoners. So the
Whoa.
gulags in America are far larger than any in history. The Soviet gulags, nothing by comparison to America's.
Okay. So by comparison then, would you have any numbers on how big the American Gulag is compared to Soviet Gulag?
Yes, there are presently 2.3 million people incarcerated in America, and at the height of the Soviet Union's power, the gulags never, to anyone's knowledge, had more than 500,000 people, which was still an enormous number. But there's 7.1 million people that are still under some court supervision or dangling by a thread and have
Hmm.
lost their rights.
Hmm.
And in 2010, the Department of Justice obliquely admitted, I say obliquely because they were writing about a case called Padilla versus Kentucky about the problems with people losing their right to vote and the right to defend themselves when they get labeled with a felony. And they admitted that 71 million Americans, approximately one of four, as the article said, now have a criminal conviction.
Whoa.
And as part of this whole progressive system, if you track back these laws, you will find that they, as the founders of progressivism, very, very racist group. As example, President Woodrow Wilson, one of the first things he did was fire every black in the federal government. So, I mean,
Mm.
he was an open racist and kicked the head of the NAACP or the black leaders out of his office, refused to see them during his presidency.
Mm.
So that was the start. And if you look at the laws presently on the books, they target blacks, Hispanics, and white conservatives. It's blatant. If you would like, I'll give an example of that.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, if you are a country clubber that likes to use cocaine,
Mhm.
you have one sentence. But if you're a black person in the urban ghetto area and you mix it with 50% baking powder and bake it into a rock to make
Okay.
it more portable, then you have 100 times the sentence of the guy over at the country club snorting the straight stuff up his nose. So
Whoa.
uh, you can't, but it's historically and prevalently a black drug, crack cocaine, but all that is the pure stuff from the country club mixed with baking soda. So it's just when you really delve into these laws and how ridiculous they are frankly targeted, I believe, by the progressives to remove the rights of these people so they can't vote and can't participate in the democratic portions of our constitutional republic.
Okay. And does anyone in the government willing to acknowledge this so-called this aspect of progressivism and what it really is?
Well, I don't know if you saw it last week, but an undercover reporter, a guy named James O'Keefe, filmed many of these deep state progressives, as they're now called, and they were openly admitting that they're members of the Democratic Socialists of America, and they are there not to do a job for we, the people who pay them these grossly overpriced salaries, but they are there to promote the progressive socialism and undermine the present administration because he's not one of them.
Mm.
But there are almost 2 million of these people, most of whom, as they said on the film last week, so we can't be fired. We're federal employees. So they can't do anything to us unless we get caught outright breaking the law. But they openly admitted that they spend their days working to promote socialism and progressivism rather than doing the job for which they were hired.
Mm. Okay, okay. So does the media play any part in this advancement of, I know, what people call the advancement of progressive agenda?
Absolutely, and they are, and this is also part of that plan that hails back to the 1870s, and some of the wealthiest Americans supported it. For example, J.P. Morgan, who was a very, very strong funder of the progressive movement in America and put up the money basically behind Woodrow Wilson.
Mm.
He bought up the 26 newspapers that controlled public opinion back when they were trying to push through this agenda of Wilson and his backers,
Mm.
and that was the consolidation of the news media that began. But this worsened, and it was very intentional because if you can control the media, you can control the narrative.
Mm.
And in 1983, a wonderful Washington Post, very, very, very left-wing gentleman named Ben Bagdikian wrote a book called The New Media Monopoly, and he was bemoaning the fact that the consolidation of American media was down to just 50 major corporations from thousands, and he was the canary in the coal mine, saying we're running out of oxygen. This has got
Mm.
to change. And Bagdikian was an Armenian who survived the Turkish massacre in his youth, and then his family escaped to America. So he had seen it raw and firsthand what happens when these things go to their end game.
Mm.
So he wrote that book again about the fourth or fifth version in 2016, just before he died, and the media consolidation was down to just 5 major corporations that control over 82% of the world's media.
Wow.
And if you throw in CBS and NBC in America and knock out Bertelsmann, the European giant that was built and strengthened during the Nazi era by printing anti-Semitic literature, if you knock out Bertelsmann out of the group and add in NBC and CBS, America Media, 6 corporations, including Disney and a handful of others, and Time Warner, General Electric's in the business. Disney is big in the news media now. They control 92% of American media. Now, I don't mean just CNN and things like that. I'm talking about films, books, publishing of magazines, everything, cable. You add it all up, 6 companies now control it. And almost all of these, according to Ben Bagdikian, not me, he was a great journalist and researcher, go back to a group of the wealthiest billionaires on the planet, 15 of them. Just 15 of these rich progressives. So this was part of the plan. It had to be. So I've been calling for the breakup of these monopolies for 20 years, saying you cannot let one handful of the richest people in the world control all media across the board. So
Mm.
it's very dangerous. And And there is talk now in the present administration about trying to break up these giants because they have an agenda, and it's certainly not an American agenda.
All right, okay. So I have to ask, because this is a big issue right now. This is a big item right now. Social media. What part does social media play in either supporting or breaking up the media monopoly that you mentioned?
I think there right now are only salvation. A lot of the information, of course, is suspect, but that is good, and I think that's why the millennials that I have gotten to know and greatly appreciate are such skeptics. You know, advertising was fairly new when I was a kid. I mean, I remember when we got our first TV. I
Hmm.
hope I'm not dating myself too back to the dinosaurs too badly, but Alex. But so this whole idea of being assaulted with messages all day long and somebody trying to change your mind has been a good thing because these millennials don't believe anything. They check it out, they do their work, they do their homework, and I'm very, very happy to see that because the skepticism brought about by the assault from one voice, I think has gotten these young folks to really start checking things out. And social media does allow a number of viewpoints and voices to be heard. And as you see now, the new giants of social media are trying to clamp down on any speech that's not progressive. So
Hmm.
we're seeing it again, and I hope they get broken up as well. They're all in violation of the antitrust regulations that have been on the books since 1938.
Okay, okay. So yeah, that's a lot of interesting stuff right there. Let me get into another aspect that you talk about in your book. Devolution. What is devolution?
Well, I, I say that we don't need a revolution because we already had the absolute most wonderful system of governance that mankind has ever imagined. We just need to devolve back to what we're supposed to be. We're so far out of the boundaries, and just to get it, because I also read a report the other day that only 1 in 10 kids graduating from high school today have any concept of what's in the Constitution. And back in the
Hmm.
1990s, they removed them from the walls of the classrooms. When I was in school, every single classroom from grade 1 up had a copy of the Constitution on the wall, and we were required to learn it. We had civics classes. Were taught the rights under it. You can't even discuss it now. It's not there. George Washington was the number one hero in history, according to American students. Now, Karl Marx is. So,
Hmm.
so this is also very, very intentional. But if you go back to what that document says, it is so simple and so clear, and nothing has changed. It's not like that things can improve. If, as we say in the Declaration and the Constitution, if all men are created equal, then that's that. How can you progress beyond it if you and I and every other person has equal opportunity and is to be treated equally and fairly under the law? How do you progress beyond that? You can only go backwards to something less fair under feudalism or what these elite progressives want. And then Jefferson and Madison also wrote that we're endowed with certain inalienable rights.
Hmm.
Well, if that's so, then that's it. How can you progress beyond that? You and I have the right to be left alone, to live our lives and pursue liberty and happiness as we wish.
Hmm.
Then how can you create 314,000 ways to put us in prison and be progressing? You're going backwards. You're
Hmm.
a police state. And one final point, as the Constitution is very clear that in its opening, that government derives its powers from us, from we the people and the states that voted to create it.
Hmm.
So how did they pass the 17th Amendment in 1913 as part of the progressive agenda to take away the representation of the states in the Senate? Because the Senate, in the Constitution, it says senators, two from each state, are elected by the legislatures thereof. And
Hmm.
it's the only thing in the Constitution that the founders absolutely forbid being changed was that. Yet the
Mm.
progressives push it through anyway and sold it through J.P. Morgan's newspapers and everybody else as a populist idea. Well, why should the states get a vote? So now we have 100 basically extra congressmen at large that are being bought off by the corporations and the backers of progressivism, just like the congressmen.
Okay, okay. So the present day senators and they based on this viewpoint, they really have no allegiance to the state they supposedly serve. Is this correct?
Absolutely none, and they prove it every day.
Mhm. Okay.
And that's what's allowed us to get in all of this trouble, because if you just think about the job, how it changed, your job, if I'm in the legislature and we elect to send Alex Lim to Washington, your job was to protect our powers in the balance of power, and that was the most important balance of power, was the states controlling the federal government through the Senate and what it
Mm.
could do. It could never spend more money than it took in, because the senators knew that after import duties and excise taxes, that any shortfall would go back to their states allocated by the census as to what percentage or what portion of the deficit was theirs. Now,
Mm.
if you're there in the Senate and you're letting my state get in because of a spend-through federal government and it usurping powers from us, and we allow you to get us in trouble, you're not going to have that job long. The legislatures will choose someone else to take your place,
Right.
and that used to happen. So once that they kicked out that balance, we're now 20 trillion in debt. We've got a private central bank printing money that has no value, which is unconstitutional as well. And they passed an income tax so they could tax us, which was also unconstitutional. So again, my premise in restoring America is that almost every problem we have today, you can trace its root back to our departure from what was the best system of governance ever in the world,
Mm.
the
Oh,
Constitution.
right. Okay. So we've been talking about the government essentially for the time just now. I'd like to talk hear your opinions a little bit on another aspect of of American life, which is corporations. What can you say about corporations and their effect on the United States?
The man that many would say was the prophet and saint of capitalism, Adam Smith, back when he wrote Wealth of Nations in 1776, he described corporations as a nuisance. In fact, he said the best thing I can say about a corporation or a joint stock company is that they are absolutely a nuisance. And he said that they always bribe the legislature to restrict trade, to give them an advantage over others. And so I'm with Adam on that. They are absolutely an anomaly that has changed since 1886. Again, the progressives pushed through legislation to make corporations citizens.
Hmm.
Well, the word corporation is never mentioned in the Constitution. As I quote in the book from Thomas Jefferson, he hated them. He said that he wished they would be stillborn, because already back in the 1700s they were challenging by deance the power of the federal government. So they are absolutely, and that again is part of this whole progressivism. Wealthy elites running these huge corporations internationally and media companies that are beyond any power that should have been allowed. And they've allowed these monopolies now of banks. You remember too big to fail? Well,
Right.
there's nothing in the Constitution that isn't too big to fail. They've allowed them to usurp and soak up banks, and Frank Dodd legislation of a few years ago, of course, made it where small banks can't afford the average of 2 to 3 million to comply with Frank Dodd, so they went out of business, and the big banks soaked them up. It's just absolutely horrible. And Wall Street companies are so huge and have so much power that they basically are like a shadow government, and so they've got to be not not necessarily broken up. But if you go back again to the constitutional powers, Alex, then they could not donate money to a political campaign.
Hmm.
Only warm-blooded, breathing human beings who lived within the district, your district, could vote for you. So
Hmm.
now corporations, bought their citizenship, and that story is also in the book. It is the most incredible. It's a more amazing than fiction. It was in a case in 1886, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad,
Hmm.
and now imagine if they had a case against Google and today and Amazon and Twitter,
Hmm.
and you found out that the Supreme Court, when they were hearing a tax case against Google, put in Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon, as the clerk that day, and he added his own notes in the case that had nothing to do with it, but said that corporations are citizens. If you heard a story like that, it's almost unbelievable, but that's exactly what happened back in 1886. It was a case against a railroad, and they allowed, the clerk that day was J.C. Bancroft Davis, the president of Newburgh Railroad in New York,
Hmm.
one of the beneficiaries of the suit, and he wrote in by hand after the case. The tax case had nothing to do with corporate citizenship. He wrote in by hand that before the case began, Chief Justice Waite and said, well, we don't need to discuss the corporate aspect or citizenship aspect of corporations. That's not what this case is about.
Hmm.
So Davis wrote in that Justice Waite said that he agreed that corporations were citizens. So that was the one line that had nothing to do with the case, was before it even started,
Hmm.
that after that they challenged and challenged and challenged all the way up to 1909. I think there were 17 different cases. They piled on, and they always referred to, well, in this case, the clerk wrote in that corporations are citizens. So
Hmm.
and anyway, so it's all a scam and a sham, and corporations. It's a progressive corporatocracy now,
Hmm.
ruled by elites. They won. So,
Hmm.
I don't even know how it can be reversed, but I would not have wasted the time in my new life from here writing about this topic unless I thought we finally have a disruptor. Like him or hate him, I don't care.
Hmm.
But this guy is not a progressive, and he is calling it like it is, and he's shaking it up, and that's why they hate him so much.
Okay, okay, cool. So, geez, so how I wish we could have gone to this more. I mean, we should more time. Especially, I was gonna ask about your history, but suffice to say, you were essentially imprisoned for several years by the United States judicial system, weren't you? I mean, that's one of the reasons why you're in Poland right now.
That's right. I just, it's not safe. And under the Obama administration, after a federal judge from another state ordered me to be released because I was never convicted in or by any court of jurisdiction.
Mm.
So they rode me around for 87 months, 29 moves between jails and prisons. So I know it from the inside out. And that's when I started studying law and realized that, my God, the whole thing goes back to this progressivism, creating laws that the Constitution doesn't allow, and there is no accountability. The judge who did this in the Eastern District of North Carolina, 87 years old, still on the bench, breaking the law every day. Nothing happened to him. Nothing happened to the agents. Nothing happened to anybody involved, and I was never convicted. And then the Obama group, when I started writing, and I did a TED talk that went viral, and they made a movie on my first book about that called Justice Denied. It's still in print. It became something of a classic, and still, prisoners all over the country are reading it because there's a lot of law in there that was put in the story to help them.
Mm.
But anyway, nobody ever had a penalty. And then this same judge in the Eastern District back in the Obama days sent his marshals to threaten me and say, "You either shut up or we'll do it to you again."
Hmm.
And I would shut up because they'd already taken everything from me except for life itself. I'd lost my family, my wealth, my reputation, everything. But then they started attacking my family, breaking into their homes, threatening them that if I didn't shut up, they would make up something against them. So that's when I got a ticket to Eastern Europe, and I haven't ever been back.
Right. Okay. Well, actually, that kind of leads to my next question, because I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people who are listening to this or who will read your book and think, this can't happen in the United States. I mean, this is the land of liberty, freedom, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, sure, it can happen in the Banana Republic, but not in the United States. Unless you came up to that person, you had only one time to tell that person one thing. What would be that one thing you'd tell him about his viewpoint?
That 8 out of 10 people that go to prison or the electric chair, the government has now admitted they get it wrong, either by intent or error. 82% actually is the number.
Mhm.
You want the source because people won't believe it. I wanted to not believe it, but after working on 400 non-capital criminal cases, I know that I never saw one where the government didn't break the law to put the person in prison. So I believe that statistic with all my heart. Now, this is the courts themselves found this out, Alex, and they reviewed 5,760 cases from a 23-year period, state and federal level. And the courts themselves did this review. And this was actually a study, I'll say it on the record, a summary of the Columbia University study by Professor James S. Liebman, Liebman.
Mhm.
It's called A Broken System, Error Rates in Capital Cases. Now, out of that, they found that in 73% of the capital cases where they're putting the person to death,
Mhm.
that they so violated the rights of the citizen, as I'm talking about, without penalty, because judges and prosecutors have complete immunity now. They granted it to themselves judicially, not legislatively.
Mhm.
So 73% of these people were so violated that the outcome was questionable, and 9% of them, by the court's admission, were completely innocent when they were put to the hazard.
Mhm.
So that's the courts admitting 8 out of 10. Now, can you imagine any other profession, any other job in the world where you can screw up 8 out of 10 times and keep your job and not have any penalty for destroying and ending someone's life? It's
Right.
horrific.
Right. Right. Okay. Okay. Got that.
That's my one response to your one question, guy.
All right. Fantastic. Okay. So, in the last minute or so of this interview, Howell, are there any last words of wisdom you'd like to share to inspire listeners?
Well, I'm not satisfied with either of the political parties in America, but at this point, if the Republican Party can get some new blood in there that will back this president, I think he's the only possibility we've had in the last 40 years to change the course of America back toward what worked and to break us from this progressive grip. And the Bushes were as bad as the Obamas and the Clintons, the daddy and the son. So they were progressives all the way back to Preston L. Bush, George's granddaddy. He was a very, very solid progressive. And so none of them are any good. We need a disruptor. We've got one. We need to use him before they kill him or run him out of town.
All right. Okay. Okay. Got that. Cool. All right then. So in closing, the book is Restoring America by Returning to Its Constitution. The author is our guest, Howell W. Woltz. So Howell, thank you very much for being an author of story. I must say it was a very enlightening talk with you.
Thank you so much for your time. I enjoyed it.
You're welcome. So everyone, I invite you all to check out Restoring America. And of course, please feel free to subscribe to our channel. So catch you all next time on Author Story Weekly Interviews with another amazing topic and another amazing author.